Hi everyone, welcome to my researchED Durrington presentation on making kids cleverer, one particular aspect from my book, which I'm going to be talking about what knowledge. Sean Durrington, as you know, has specified that this must use some software which seems fiendishly difficult to use. So if there are any technical problems, then blame him, not me. So I'm just going to start by talking about the central idea, which is that we can make children cleverer by getting them to know more. And so I think we can make children cleverer, and I think the area that we should focus on is the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence is your raw reasoning power. It's your ability to solve problems about which you know nothing, about which none of your prior experience would be of any help. So if you were, I don't know, abducted by aliens and left to survive on an alien landscape, your fluid intelligence would govern how well you were likely to cope. Your crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, is your ability to apply prior knowledge to solve problems. So what you already know, how useful is that? How good are you at applying that to contend with the difficulties of life? Now, contrary to the sounds of the names, fluid intelligence sounds like it ought to be something that's shifting and different all the time, but in fact, it's fairly fixed. So we know it increases as we mature. By the time we reach our mid-20s, it peaks, and after that, we start hemorrhaging fluid intelligence. We start becoming slower, and we're less good at it. So we can see it's fluid in that sense, that it changes with maturity. But there doesn't really appear to be much that we can do to improve beyond what we have at a particular age. So there are various researchers who've looked at things that we could do to improve fluid intelligence. Those normally take the form of N-back reasoning, which basically that involves looking at number strings and sort of multiplying them backwards and that sort of thing. So there are some claims that you can improve fluid intelligence by doing that kind of thing. But those are countered by other researchers who look at the claims of the fluid intelligence crew and say actually they don't transfer to anything beyond the N-back training. And it's an ongoing scholarly debate. It may be in years to come we'll find a way to increase fluid intelligence, but it's not likely that you're going to stumble across one in the classroom. Crystallized intelligence is something that increases throughout your life. So we know that as long as you live, you're going to be adding to your store of crystallized intelligence. You'll know more and therefore be able to apply what you know more widely to solve problems. And so it really is true that as we age, we become wiser on the whole. And it's relatively well understood how we can go about increasing crystallized intelligence, because we've been getting children to know more for thousands of years. So it's not to say that that's necessarily easy, but it's an awful lot easier than trying to increase fluid intelligence. So the central claim that I'm making in the book and in this talk is that by increasing the quality and the quantity of what people know, what children know, we also increase their crystallized intelligence. And just very briefly, before we go on to think about the idea of what knowledge, just briefly on why knowledge matters. All of the things that we value in the project of education, children being creative and able to think critically and working together to collaborate on problems and all of that great stuff, it all requires something to operate on. Nobody can think about something that they don't know. So all of those abilities, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, they all are governed by knowledge. And I think it would probably be better to think of them as functions of knowledge rather than as some sort of free-floating generic skill. And just to try that for a moment, have a go at thinking about something that you have never heard of. Try and think about something that you know absolutely nothing about. literally impossible, and obviously quite impossible to think creatively and critically about something that you're in complete ignorance of. The corollary to all of that is that the more you know about something, the more possible it becomes to be creative. So that if you know something well, or if you know a lot about something, you're able to think, hang on a second, what would happen if I replaced this with that? And or you could be critical and think, I'm not sure about this piece. Maybe I could, maybe I've got some questions I need to ask about that. And suddenly these things become possible, but they're a result of the quality and the quantity of what we know. So bringing all of that back to the project of school and what knowledge we select to teach, I think it's true to say and to argue that all knowledge is potentially precious, but it isn't equally precious. It doesn't all have the same value, and so curriculum time being finite, we need to make brutal choices, and so two of the things that I'm going to suggest we might use as a guide. Firstly, practicing certain basics to the point of fluency or automaticity, so that there are some foundational aspects of knowledge which are so useful that we come back to them so often that it's worth becoming fluent in them. And some of these are fairly well understood, like number bonds, times tables, place value, some of those mathematical concepts, and the basics of reading, the ability, phoneme, grapheme, correspondences, the ability to turn spellings into sounds rapidly. Those are fairly unarguably important and worth automatizing. Other things invite a debate. The second idea that I've summed up in that little opposition there of Teflon or Velcro is just the observation, the notion that some children come to school with what seems like the equivalent of intellectual Velcro, that what they know enables the stuff of school to stick to them more easily. As a result, they find learning more easier. Other children that I've experienced myself, and I'm sure you have too, it's like more like that their minds are coated in Teflon, that the things that we try to teach them slide off. They don't have anything to grip to. And so the second area of knowledge that I think is particularly important can be summed up in that idea of intellectual Teflon. What are the things that we could give children that which would enable the stuff of school to stick better to them? So one of these ideas is Michael Young's notion of powerful knowledge, which I'm sure you've come across, and it can be perhaps summed up in that little brief idea there, that powerful knowledge is that which allows us to make reliable predictions and explanations and generalizations about the world. So to think about things that we don't have direct experience of, and to know things about them which are likely to be true, even though we don't necessarily have direct experience of them. So that might be a criteria for determining whether whether a piece of knowledge is powerful. And I've got here for you some ideas of items of knowledge for us to discuss whether they're powerful, and if they're powerful, how powerful they might be. So if we think about these things, we'll just pick out a few of them. We've got there at the top the germ theory of disease, which currently perhaps is of particular importance with what we're experiencing with our lockdowns. And I think at a naive level, a lot of children will experience being told at the moment, wash your hands, stay at home, don't spread disease. And it's, they'll be accepting that as, obviously right and true, because the people in their lives are telling it to them. But do they understand why washing your hands makes such a difference? I mean, naively, you could look at your hands and think they look fairly clean. There's no obvious dirt on them. Why would I need to wash them? And that person over the road also looks relatively clean, and what possible danger could there be in contact with them? And the idea that germs are spread by diseases are spread, by invisible germs, too small to see by the naked eye, is something that opens up our understanding about the world and allows things to make sense. The second item on the list there, that learning to write using point, evidence and explanation, I would say that is not powerful knowledge. That's knowledge which may enable you to better complete a task, but it isn't the kind of thing which offers reliable predictions, offers ways to explain how the world works, or is something that you can generalize across. Well, I suppose you can generalize it in a very limited sense, that you could apply it to lots of different essay styles or types of writing, but it isn't really offering something powerful. Coastal erosion, is that powerful? And if it's powerful, what are the powerful bits? And maybe the erosion bit is more powerful than the coastal bit. Maybe the fact that the coasts erode is true and important, but not as important as the underlying idea that erosion happens. And I think that this does contradict, like germ theory, it does contradict children's naive experience of the world, that we look at the natural world, we look at what surrounds us, and we think it's always been the way it is today, that it's unchanging and permanent, and it won't be different in years to come. And the knowledge that the world is in constant but slow geological change is something that is a powerful concept. Trigonometry, and I think I've included this because I think it's an interesting example, because when you ask a lot of people, is trigonometry powerful, they say no, because I've never had to use it. And the how often you have to use it argument is not a good indication of whether or not something is powerful. That trigonometry is powerful because it enables you to apply mathematical conceptions, calculations to the world that you can absolutely guarantee are going to be always the case. So whilst I may not have used trigonometry recently, I'm very glad that it's been used by bridge builders, for instance. That somebody has it is more important than whether everyone is able to use it. I'm just going to skip down to the rise of Nazi Germany. And I think that's another interesting example, because it's important, and you won't get many history teachers, for instance, who want to argue against the teaching of the rise of Nazi Germany. But is it powerful? Is a slightly separate question, and I think that it's at least worth arguing and thinking about the fact that the particular historical lens that the Nazis supplies may end up narrowing our ability to think critically about the world. That you get into any sort of particularly online discussion about behaviour or government or rights or responsibilities, and sooner or later somebody will call you a fascist or a Nazi or compare you to Hitler, and these analogies are too readily available. The lessons of the rise of Nazi Germany are no doubt important. Culturally, they may be also really important, but whether or not they represent powerful knowledge is a different argument. And the underlying principles about tyranny and how it can arise could be taught by many different vehicles. Maybe that is the best one, maybe it isn't. But that's maybe gives you a tool set for thinking about the information, the ideas within your curriculum, and trying to get a sense of whether they're powerful and how much power they have relative to other concepts. So that's one idea, powerful knowledge. The second, very popular at the moment, is the notion of cultural capital, enshrined now in inspection speak. Inspectors going in and looking for cultural capital. And I want to contrast here cultural capital with the idea of being cultured, because I think there's an awful lot of very well-intentioned and no doubt valuable idea, with schools taking children to local museums and making them look at the art and appreciate truth and beauty and all of that great stuff. But I think there's something quite different between what's meant by cultural capital and being cultured. And so going to a museum, going to a theatre, experiencing culture might make you more cultured, but it's what you interact with which grants you the capital which can enhance your life chances. So if we bring to mind the paintings and the artists which might confer the most cultural capital, what comes to mind? What are the artists and the works of art that we intuitively think must have the most cultural capital? Maybe you'll have thought of the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in the world, Leonardo da Vinci. Maybe you'll be thinking about something by Van Gogh, maybe Sunflowers or Starry Night. Maybe you're thinking about Banksy and some of his quite iconic, famous graffiti art. Which does Banksy have more or less cultural capital than Van Gogh? It's a moot question. I would suggest that all of those examples have high cultural capital, and they have cultural capital because they are shared as knowledge by many thousands of people, and it's that quality of being shared which gives cultural capital. So we might successfully argue that Leonardo da Vinci is a better artist than Banksy, and we might say that he's more culturally important than Banksy. But has Leonardo got more cultural capital than Banksy? Maybe not. It's whether you can catch references and have common the ability to communicate with people beyond your immediate sphere. So if we bring these images up, you may or may not know the details of the names, the title of the paintings or who painted them, but you will probably recognise them. And that sort of visual recognition of those particular works of art are part of cultural capital, of seeing those images and going, oh yes, I have a frame of reference that I recognise what those things might be saying about the world. And so the idea of cultural capital in opposition to being cultured is about sharing knowledge. It's about navigating conversations. And so things like this, what are the culturally rich ideas that we can get from Orwell's 1984 that whether or not people are aware of 1984 or have indeed read it, they'll probably have heard of some of the ideas within it, like Big Brother and Room 101. And those widespread ideas are part of a currency of ideas that Orwell discusses in the novel. Knowing what a Damascene conversion is, you don't have to know the details of St. Paul's conversion. You don't have to know anything about Damascus, but recognising that Damascene conversion is signifying a sudden and dramatic transformation in a person's character gives you cultural capital. Knowing that you don't need to know about the Iliad necessarily to recognise the idea of an Achilles heel, but you have to recognise it. You have to know that it's a weakness in an otherwise impenetrable set of armour, that it's someone incredibly powerful who has a weakness that can be exploited. That knowing what it means to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune is more important than having read Hamlet and knowing what's being, if you know what's meant by that, that's part of that gives you cultural capital. If you've read Hamlet, if you've read Orwell, that makes you cultured, and these are not necessarily quite the same things. And this is something that was explored by E.D. Hirsch in his most recent book, Why Knowledge Happens, and he makes the point, quick glass of water here, that there's a tension between what offers cultural literacy and what we think is important in terms of social justice. And he sets up this opposition here and says that because the knowledge that's shared is likely to have been around quite a long time, that the things that have been known longest and shared most widely will be reasonably inert. But that comes into conflict with the idea of deprivileging the privileged. And lots of people, arguably rightly, would like to tear down what's considered to be the assumptions that make up cultural capital and replace them with something new. And that may or may not be a worthy aim. But just tearing down and replacing means that we essentially we create a different kind of elite. We'll have some people that know something, but most people that aren't able to share that language, and inevitably, people will prefer to take part in the discussions that they can take part in and use the frame of reference that they have. So, um, so whilst I'm not at all against the idea of deprivileging the currently privileged, I think that's best achieved from a position of knowledge. That if you know all of the frames of references that other people have in common and are able to speak that language, then you can start to replace slowly, piece by piece, some of those items. And in terms of, in a school context, the type of curriculum that we're offering, if we're decolonising the curriculum, that's an interesting and a worthy aim. But are we doing it too quickly and too fast? And if we are, the danger is that we'll just make our students ignorant of what most people know, and that doesn't give anybody an advantage. And the children that are most likely to be disadvantaged by that kind of act are the ones who begin as being most disadvantaged. So better, I would suggest, to give children knowledge of the dominant culture and then teach them to critique it from within, show them what's wrong with it, teach them the British Empire and then say, here's the problems of the British Empire, teach them Shakespeare and then say, how did Shakespeare take on this cultural hegemony, and all of those sorts of notions. So thinking about whatever it is that you teach, a starting point might be to say, here's the subject that I teach, what knowledge is most widely shared? Because that's the knowledge that's most likely to offer your students the highest cultural capital. And notions about whether that belongs to a particular group in society or whether or not its value is subjective are ideas that you can discuss and critique as you teach. But the going back to the idea that knowledge is important in order to think critically and creatively, you need to know something before you're able to critique it. Just saying something's rubbish and not knowing what it is, what value is that going to offer to our students? So in all of this, thinking about these notions in the curriculum about automaticity, and powerful knowledge, the ability to generalize and predict, and sharing this cultural capital that's shared by those around us, and making that, as far as we can, the backbones of what we teach. The final thing to think about is, how do we know if we've been successful with all of that? And typically, when we try and evaluate our success in terms of, and obviously this year presents some very interesting problems, but typically what we do is we look at things like external exams and we say, students have been achieved these marks, and therefore we know whether or not if we've been successful. And one of the things that I'd just like to throw in as a thing to consider is that children who begin with the greatest advantages are the most likely to be successful whatever you do. They're the ones that need school at least. Often they're successful despite us. That regardless of what we do and the mistakes that we make, they have a network, a safety net to enable them to do well. The amount of private tutoring, for instance, that goes on is something that's quite well known. So instead, when you're looking at data and trying to work out whether you've been successful, look first, maybe not only, but look first at how well the most disadvantaged students have been doing, because they're not likely to do well despite you. If they do well, it's more likely to be because of you. So if they're doing particularly well, you can be reasonably sure that what you're doing is likely to be successful. If they're doing particularly badly, again, that's likely to be something that's within your power, perhaps, to do something about. And the final point that I'd make on all this is that what's likely to work best for your most disadvantaged students is also what's likely to work best for everybody. Nobody's going to be disadvantaged about building a curriculum in this kind of way. I hope that that you found some of that interesting and useful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual conference. I'll just finish by saying that it's a pleasure to talk to you, and it's a strange thing to do from the solitude of my office, and I'm sorry we can't all be together, and I'm particularly sorry I can't hear you clapping. Thanks ever so much for your time and attention. Bye bye.